We will dive into the next topic right away. So I welcome Ben Ramilingam to the stage. So a very warm welcome to this spotlight session on innovation and humanitarian change. My name is Sonja Höfelmann and I work as a research fellow with the Center for Humanitarian Action. And today I have the immense honor to talk to Ben Ramilingam about innovation and humanitarian change. And among some other things, we will talk, for example, about factors that enable or inhibit change and what are the actors that drive humanitarian innovations. You can already see that Ben is setting up some of the slides. So while he's doing that, I'll quickly introduce him to those of you who have not read anything or listened to Ben before. Ben Ramilingam is a British author, researcher and innovator. He's currently the executive director of the recently founded United Kingdom Humanitarian Innovation Hub, and perhaps he will say a few things about that later during his talk. He has led and conducted research with some of the leading institutions such as ALNAP, the Overseas Development Institute, and the Institute for Development Studies. He has also shared some of his findings and also thoughts in several acclaimed books, among them The Aid on the Edge of Chaos and also a forthcoming book called Upshift. Last year, Ben was honored as Humanitarian Changemaker of the Decade by the START Network, among the many other honorary awards that he has received for his immense work, leadership and contributions to humanitarian change. With that, a very warm welcome to you, Ben, and thanks for joining us today. My first question to you would be, you are an innovator yourself because not only have you pushed for innovation in humanitarian action as a topic of research, but also by realizing innovations, for example, by establishing the HIF, the Humanitarian Innovation Fund, which gives resources to people who want to try something new. So with that, I would like to give you the floor to tell us a little bit about the state of innovation in the humanitarian system, and perhaps also comment a bit if you would say that the humanitarian system or if humanitarian action is indeed an innovative sector. With that, I hand over to you. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Sonja, and welcome everyone to this Innovation Spotlight. It's great to be speaking to you all today at the CHAR meeting and to contribute to your thinking and hopefully your future collective work programme on humanitarian innovation. So what I want to talk to you about today is where humanitarian innovation came from, how it works, and some of the challenges and opportunities we still face in making it work in ways that are impactful and transformative. And I want to frame these in the context of the Grand Bargain and the related reforms that are the focus of this conference. And I want to close the conversation with Sonja by sharing some of the perspectives on the future of humanitarian innovation and how we might learn lessons from successful innovations for how we do reforms in the future. If there is a grander bargain to be struck, what lessons might we learn from innovation efforts? Now, the first thing I want to say is, when I first started working on humanitarian innovation, it used to feel something like this. The suggestion that the humanitarian sector needed innovation, that it needed to change, was roundly rejected. And innovation was seen as a private sector idea that had nothing to do with humanitarianism. And that might have been at a systemic level, but the reality was, as I worked on and responded to different crises, I was observing many people that were innovating, local actors, national actors, communities themselves, people responding organizations like ActionAid, who we've already heard from today, doing transformative things, but often doing it under the radar, doing it despite the system rather than because of it, and then hiding the innovations because the mainstay of the system couldn't really handle it, couldn't really handle transformation, didn't really want change. I think things really changed in the sector around about the time we launched the Humanitarian Innovation Fund in 2009, But actually, events have a massive bearing on our sector. And we tend to change when major crises happen. So the Rwanda evaluation, the Rwanda genocide, and the response to that led to a massive movement towards accountability, a quiet revolution, some call it. But the formation of the Spear movement, ALNAP, CAP, all started around the Rwanda evaluation. The tsunami again led to a call for change, a whole set of things around localization, around flipping the system, and so on. And with Haiti, I think we saw a real shift in the role of innovation and technology and how it featured in responses. And Haiti was what really saw a call for a more innovative humanitarian sector. But what underpinned that? What underpinned that shift? And I think one big reason is to be found in the context in which we operate. That there was around that time growing pressure on the humanitarian enterprise, both from constructive and less constructive sources, in order to get the house in order, to be more effective, to be more accountable, to use scarce resources to maximum effect. But there was also growing opportunities and the rise of new technologies, the involvement of new players and humanitarian actors, the growth in transformative technologies, most notably things like mobile money, which had changed the lives of poor and vulnerable people. And I think there were new kinds of crises, as well as new agendas, like the World Humanitarian Summit, that really created a kind of space for humanitarian innovation. But within that, what's happened within the sector? What's happened to drive change? And I think we can describe or delineate a growing movement. And there are four specific changes we've seen. We've seen a growth of new funds, a new attempts to finance innovative activities and how to incentivize innovation through the system. There's been a growth in new innovation teams and labs and units and take-up of innovation management capabilities within partners. Many new jobs with innovation in the title. Many donors are making innovation a core strategic imperative. There are many new kinds of partnerships and many collaborations emerging with the private sector, with technologists, with space agencies, with the military, and increasingly people focusing on affected communities themselves and the realization that the empowerment of affected communities is essential for true innovation. And then finally, there's been a rethink of some core principles of the humanitarian agenda through the World Humanitarian Summit, through the Grand Bargain, through ideas of systems, of localization. But what does that actually all amount to? And I think a little bit like the Grand Bargain itself, if we look at the humanitarian innovation effort, we see a number of lessons, both in the form of challenges and opportunities. And I think these resonate very strongly with what I've been hearing across the CHAR conference so far. And I want to just detail 5 challenges and 5 opportunities. So in terms of the challenges, a lot of innovation work is still wedded to existing mental models, existing assumptions, and existing ideas. And therefore, it tends to be incremental rather than radical. We tend to be quite reductionist in the way that we see humanitarian innovation. So we define needs and gaps for crisis-affected communities, and we try and fill these gaps in very fairly narrow single-point interventions, rather than actually trying to look at systemic change. In the humanitarian sector, innovation, like everything else, has been the subject of a pronounced, almost accepted lack of collaboration. Every humanitarian player tends to plow their own separate innovation furrow, and this leads to a lot of replication and a lot of institutionally branded innovations in crisis response. And that means that very few innovations actually reach scale because they slam into me-first institutional interests. And this then relates to the next point around proliferation, that where we used to see masses of reports that no one read, the innovation-related efforts risk seeing a whole host of technologies, tools, and apps that no one uses. And then finally, in position, we have a continued tendency to kick engagement with crisis-impacted communities down the road, hoping that someone else picks it up. And this is despite the fact that most transformative innovations have always and will always be because they empower and enable communities to put their own recovery first and put their own skills, their own innovative capabilities in the foreground, in the center ground of innovation efforts. In the rush towards humanitarian innovation, there's not been nearly enough emphasis on actors in developing countries, communities themselves, civil society, private sector, and government bodies. And I think we're seeing this now in terms of decolonizing aid. A lot of people talking about we need to decolonize and decentralize innovation. And indeed, I've just done some work for the OECD looking at the role of national and local innovators in the COVID response. And we found that even in the lowest income settings, the innovations that have been generated for COVID, over 25% of them have come from low and middle income countries. And there's not just innovations for low income countries, but innovations that can support high income countries as well, because we're all in this massive crisis together. One of the best examples I can think of is how the US state of Massachusetts has been able to learn about how to do contact tracing from African health responders through the work of local NGOs and national NGOs. And that's really strengthened approaches to contact tracing for COVID in ways that wouldn't have been thought of in high-income country settings. The challenge we have, though, and in part the grand bargain reinforces this, that many people think about innovation as reducing management costs. And that was indeed one of the ambitions of the grand bargain. But if we focus on innovation as reducing management costs, then we're going to see innovation that continues to be incremental, reductionist, competitive, and proliferating international innovation rather than local innovation. So what's the opportunity that we face? The opportunity for innovation is to focus much more on the needs for innovation and entrepreneurship at the local level, to enable local actors and national actors to focus on the long-standing challenges they know they face, and to help them support their own ideas. And this is something we just do not do very well at the present time. Even recently, I spoke to international organizations, even in the wake of the COVID response, and people still say for local and national actors to turn around and say, we want to do it differently, they have to have a lot of confidence and a lot of institutional power, institutional weight behind them. And that shouldn't be the case. We have to be, and we must be getting better at dealing with and being open to creative and transformative solutions wherever they come, innovating without borders. And we need to be seeing innovation as synonymous with systems change. And if we can see innovation not just as being about reducing management costs, but transforming management approaches, then it can give us a wide-angle lens on the problems that we face. We need to be much more open about innovation. We need to find ways of identifying common ground, mobilizing diverse capacities in pursuit of shared goals. In here, I think the localization agenda, there's a two dimensions. You know, we're still seeing this as a kind of either or in terms of innovation, but in terms of change as well. It's either international or it's local. But actually, the reality is we need a bit of both. And if you look at things like community-based feeding therapy, which is an effort which now is at the forefront of malnutrition treatment around the world, that has replaced the previous approach for dealing with malnutrition by putting simple technologies, plum peanut, or therapeutic feeding foods in the hands of communities themselves. But it didn't come about purely because of local and national actors. You needed international actors to scan the countries where famines were happening to see the opportunities. You needed local actors to come up with the ideas. And then you needed resources that could be mobilized internationally and nationally to be able to put that into place. So I think we need to be much more open to seeing how innovation works and to integrate across our different capabilities. An inclusive, user-driven approaches where we see innovation that isn't just about short-term humanitarian needs, but also long-term developmental goals. And then the final point is empowering, that we need to see innovation as something that empowers rather than limits communities. And that relates to all kinds of things: access to technology, voice and representation, ethics. But most importantly, we cannot empower until we empathize. And empathy is absolutely critical in humanitarian innovation. I think it was a key message that came through in the last presentation on gender as well. We have to be able to empathize better and listen better. Thank you. I'm just going to hand back to you for any comments and questions, and we can have a bit more of a dialogue at this point. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful, a very dense presentation indeed. I do have a follow-up question. You mentioned some of the pressure points, and perhaps we can delve on two here that are indeed necessary to enable a change in thinking and allow for innovation to take place. And these are, of course, cash, but also perhaps COVID as a pressure point to enable more localization. So indeed, if we look at cash, we have an innovation which brought about transformational change to an entire system. So this is indeed a hugely successful innovation, so to say. What made that so successful? What are some of the learnings that could be drawn also, for example, to the localization agenda? And my follow-up question, and this is a bit unfair because it sort of perhaps frames your answer, is that my take would be that innovation with regard to cash was so successful because the big players indeed profited from this innovation. So we see that the larger organizations such as the IFRC or WFP, they are the ones rolling out big programs in cash delivery. And so is that the notion that big players are indeed profiting the reason or the enabling factor that made cash so successful? And what does that mean then for the localization agenda? So many questions in one, but perhaps, you can comment a bit on that.
Thanks. So it's interesting. So I think why did it take so long for cash to be mainstreamed across the sector? In the 19th century, cash transfers were being rolled out by the American Red Cross, by the International Committee of the Red Cross, in response to famines, in response to crises, in response to conflicts like the Russian War and the Prussian Wars. So cash transfers have been around for about 140 years before they really got mainstream. In the 1990s, there was a growing use of cash, experimental uses in many different settings. But again, a little bit like I mentioned earlier, it was being done under the radar. And actually talking about cash at the time was enough to get you blackballed by some of the major food security agencies. So I think that and at the time, studies were done and research was done, and there was a lot of social science which really showed that communities could use cash in crises and they could use it in ways which were empowering. But the fundamental reason why it wasn't done was this idea of the undeserving poor, that communities wouldn't use cash, that they couldn't be trusted to use cash, and they could only be given things. These small-scale experiments carried on, but it wasn't until the shaking moment, as Marcus put it, shaking the way we do things. And it was the tsunami that led to a real shift. And in part, you could argue that it was because of that self-serving dimension. The tsunami was so successful, and it's still the most successful crisis ever in terms of fundraising, that the sector was awash with cash, if you forgive the pun, and there needed to be a way of getting it out the door as quickly as possible. And that led to a legitimization of cash as a response. And then having applied it across 5 countries simultaneously, there was a real sense that actually this could work. Things happened at the same time. There was an attempt to learn systematically through a cash network, which I was partly involved in setting up, learning across the 5 countries. And that built up the evidence base. But in terms of transformation, we still are getting to the point where cash is maybe 10 to 15% of all humanitarian responses, but not all. It's not a silver bullet by any stretch of the imagination. And organizations have taken it on board, but there are different ways of doing cash. You can do cash in ways which are very limiting, very narrow, and very imposing, or you can do cash in ways which are transformative and systemic and open and integrative and empowering. And I think we are seeing the same thing with COVID. COVID has placed dramatic limits on the mobility of a sector where we've long seen ourselves, prided ourselves on moving people and things from one place to another. And there should have been an opportunity with COVID to really dramatically localize. But I don't think we've seen that. I think we've seen maybe international actors give the driving seat over to local actors with COVID. But they're still, if they're in the driving seat, then the car is a dual control car, and international actors have still got a little bit like a driving instructor. They're still retaining control over the movement of the car and how it moves. So I don't think we've seen with COVID the embracing of the potential for it to be a truly catalytic movement for transformation. And so what might we need to see? I think we need to see a genuine effort to move away from that business model. We need to see the incentives to move towards something new, learning about how the new ways of doing things can actually contribute. And I think there has been some of that, but not enough. And actually a really rigorous comparison of how a more empowering approach can drive better results. And Marcus has put the question in the chat about could Haiti, what might enable us to innovate in the face of climate change? I think there's some really interesting work that's coming through from the Red Cross, actually, the Charter for Humanitarian Action. And in terms of the Red Cross, it's one of the first joint statements from across the whole movement in quite some time. And I think that charter gives space and opportunities for humanitarians to innovate. But I do think we have to innovate ahead of the curve. There's a great definition of innovation that I learned from Captain Sully Sullenberger, the gentleman who successfully landed the plane in the Hudson River when it had been back in 2009, 2010. And he said, innovation is change before you're forced to. Changing before you're forced to. Now, this is very hard at an individual level. We all know people that should have given up smoking before they had the heart attack, people that should have improved their diet before they got the cancer diagnosis. And it's even harder at an institutional level to give way to change before we have to. But I think that's what we have to do when it comes to the climate crisis. We have to look at the hot spots where we're already seeing the crisis tipping into a situation the humanitarian sector cannot possibly deal with, and to use that as an incentive to drive change now. Because otherwise we're just going to be not just not effective, but we're going to be largely irrelevant in the face of the crises, the multiple crises that are coming. And I think even though COVID is now becoming a terrible crisis in many parts of the world, I think it will be dwarfed by the scale of the climate crisis. So I think we really do have to try and innovate before we have to.
Thanks. Can I link back to one aspect that you said, that indeed innovations that we just talked about, localization, but also cash, these were also successful because they were based on this, or were self-serving in the interest of those powerful organizations.
Well, initially self-serving.
Okay. So what do you think are then the incentives that are powerful enough that drive change? If we, for example, look at climate change, that indeed enable the agencies to innovate now and get ahead of the wave, as you just said.
Well, I think actually this kind of community, this kind of dialogue plays a really big role in creating those incentives, because the norms for the sector can be changed when you have enough collective action, when you have enough people coming together to say, we need to change. And where the imperative for change is shared across both local, national and international actors. Now, cash is an area where this is absolutely clear, where you can't really do cash transfers without having international resources, national local capabilities in terms of actually delivering and ensuring effective and accountable cash transfers. And this includes partnerships with local banks, local credit transfer agencies, local monitoring systems. And then communities themselves have to get on board and have to be involved in the mainstay. And I think it's that kind of collective action is the thing that has always changed the sector. It's a little bit like that quote from Margaret Mead, never never doubt the ability of a small group of committed citizens to change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I think the same is also true in the sector. But what I don't see enough of yet is actually thinking with affected communities rather than for them. We don't really think enough about changing the system rather than filling the gaps. And we're not really doing enough to empower actors on the ground. And I think if we can reorient, one of the questions has come about the top-down nature and the fragmented and duplicated nature of innovation resources. And actually, it's in the private sector, there's much more pooling of innovation resources than you would imagine in the pharmaceutical industry, in automobiles. When there are really big challenges, like, for example, trying to move away from carbon fuels and so on, the private sector rolls up their sleeves and they collaborate in order to find solutions, and then they compete in order to exploit those solutions. And I think we could actually learn a lot more about how to run joint ventures and how to run genuine partnerships, not partnerships which are only, not partnerships which are actually tilted in favor of the North and never in favor of the South, but partnerships that are based on genuine understanding of core competencies. What are international actors good at? What are national actors good at? What are the core competencies, and how can we build off the best of both? Mm-hmm. And I don't think we do nearly enough of that right now.
Many thanks. I have one follow-up question, or actually two before we close the session. And that is, last year you were taking part in a webinar and you set a metaphor for localization of a car ride. Perhaps you received a lot of feedback about that, but to me, all your constellations of that joint car ride really got me thinking of what are potential ways how to roll out localization, and also spurred on the aspects what you just said. So perhaps if you, as you said, innovative thinking is upon all of us, we should all be thinking about that. What are some of the learnings that you can share that enable innovative thinking and methods that we can use in our daily lives as researchers, but also aid workers, to enable this sort of innovative thinking?
Wow, that's a big question to answer in 1 minute. I think the main thing is that many people tend to associate innovation with creativity, with flashes of inspiration, with people, highly paid consultants that with expensive spectacles that come up with creative ideas. In fact, innovation usually comes about as a result of a disciplined, planned, and managed process. And the most important thing you can do to trigger innovation in your own lives, in your professional setting, is to simply ask the question, can we do this another way? And to get into the habit of asking that over many different situations, whether it's your personal lives, whether it's your professional lives, can we do this another way? And that all of the innovators I've worked with over the years, national, local, international, they've all asked that question and they've come up with the answer, which is there must be another way, and I can find it, and we can find it together. And it's asking these questions. And I think with innovation, I think the critical thing is to, and this is important for the humanitarian sector as well, we need to move away from being the people that can't turn up with the answers to problems. We need to move away from being the people that can't turn up with solutions. We need to become the people that turn up to ask the right questions and be willing to follow the answers wherever they take us. And that's the most important thing. And anything else is just window dressing on top of that. Yeah. And I think that's a practice we can all build up individually, and we need to build it up within teams. The most successful humanitarian innovation teams are the ones that ask that question of themselves. And I think we need to get better at doing it within our organizations.
Many thanks. Just one follow-up question, and then we'll close and make way for the next session. You recently authored a study which looked at innovation potential that was triggered due to COVID. And indeed, most of the examples that were cited there from the Global South were rather solutions of simplification, of embedding innovations within the existing structures that are in the communities. But we as Westerners often think, when we think of innovation, as these great techno fixes that, let's develop an app for that, or can we use technology to use that. And my question, and it's coming here, one meaning of innovation is taking two things and bringing them into a new context together. So my last question to you would be, is there an example of humanitarian innovation that comes to your mind that astonished you because it was so simple and yet so impactful at the same time? And yeah, with that, I'll close the session.
Thank you. I actually, Sonia, if you don't mind, there's a question which Smriti Patel has put into the chat window, and I wonder if I could answer that one as an alternative. I think it's really important.
Sure.
And it underpins, and it's about empowerment of local actors. If you don't mind, while I think your question is really important, I think hers is actually is really significant because it speaks a lot to the grand bargain piece. Would you mind if I respond to that one instead?
Go ahead.
Thank you. So, Smriti, I absolutely agree with you. I don't think local actors need to be empowered. They are empowered. They need resources to be out. When I talk about empowerment, I'm talking specifically about the way the humanitarian system operates at the moment is a disempowering system. It does not give them power. It does not enable them or give them resources to be empowered. And they might be empowered, and they are empowered and have solidarity in their context, and working with communities, working in their national settings. And we've seen this time and time again. But they do that despite the system, the international system. And sometimes they have to work really hard to maintain their sense of empowerment in the face of an international system that wants to disempower them and that works to disempower them. So I absolutely agree with you. They are already empowered. The question is, if the humanitarian system is going to maintain its relevance, it has to be an empowering system that adds to that sense of empowerment, that gives them resources to enable them to do what they already know how to do. So I hope that's a useful distinction. And I think innovation can be a tool and a method and a process that supports that. Thanks.
Many thanks for your time, and it was a very insightful conversation. Thank you, Ben. I wish we could continue, but the next Spotlight session is looking around the corner, so to say. I would close with something that Sarshid said in the panel before, that we should not be the change, that we should not wait for change, but be the change. I think that's a great motto for a future grand bargain process and transformation no change. With that, I would like to thank everyone for participating and for your comments and questions, and hand over to my colleague Andrea Steinke, who will facilitate the session on ethics. Many thanks.